Hanging Man Hill. Gaston, South Carolina is a lonely little place. Sitting just south of Columbia along 321, it's just a small crumb off the misshapen piece of pie on the United States plate that we call South Carolina. Its population has almost never gone over 2,000, and it's only 3.4 square miles in any direction. It feels even lonelier when you come here from a place like Roanoke, Virginia. After Mom lost her job, we moved into the place where the rest of the family resided. Good old South Kakalaki. I had been moping around the whole trip and the whole time on the way down there. The way I saw it, the only friends I was going to make here were fire ants and the sun. Once we got settled at 304 Dixana Drive, I always remembered that address because it was carved into the driveway, and it spelled hoe when you looked at it upside down. I immediately set into the neighborhood, just in search for friends. I didn't know how to ride a bike at the time, and I barely knew how to ride a skateboard. So I petered down the long stretch of road directly across from the front of the house, on my cheap little Walmart board, until I came to this small cul-de-sac that seemed to go uphill a little bit. Sitting outside on his front porch was this chubby kid with glasses that looked about 10 or 11 years old, about my age at the time. I really had no one else to talk to, so I asked what his name was. He told me it was Terry. He liked being outside a lot, and I didn't. But we both did seem to enjoy video games. With that, we would get along just fine. There was one thing that he hadn't told me, though, as we spent the next couple weeks riding around the neighborhood together. He was really into scary movies. Look, I'll be honest. I was a massive chicken when it came to stuff that seemed intent on forcing you to change your underwear every 5 minutes. So I didn't really like that aspect of him. But even worse, he had tons of horror movie action figures, and a fuck ton of VHS tapes of all the creepy movies you could think of stacked up in his room. Every single time I came to visit him, he would almost certainly scare the shit out of me with one of those creepy Freddy Krueger dolls, or force me to watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre with him in the dark. His room wasn't really that nice looking to begin with. He had a bunk bed. He was an only child and only his grandma lived with him, which meant he slept on the bottom with all of his slasher fix and action figures on top. There were loads of holes in the walls and everything had a generally grimy feel to it. It made those horrifying moments of watching pure terror in the dark all the more icky. One day when he finally realized that I pretty much hated any kind of horror movie he threw at me, he began to tell me urban legends, ghost stories, shit like that. Some of them were about the town as a whole, but more than not, they were about one particular neighborhood, our neighborhood. But I didn't really believe him. That is, until he told me the one about Hanging Man Hill. It was about a year after we first met each other, and we were riding around the neighborhood. By this time, Terry had told me to man up, and he eventually taught me how to ride a bike. He stopped when we were riding in front of the house that we simply called the Crack Shack, due to its residents being stoned out of their minds on a pretty regular basis. He seemed to be peering down a small pathway that went up a couple of hills the further you went back. He was usually the leader when it came to showing me new places in the neighborhood, so I didn't question a thing when he beckoned me to follow him down the trail. It was a pretty steep climb up the side of the hill, with plenty of sand and rocks to send anyone not being careful sliding straight back down. It felt as though the trees were closing in tighter and tighter on us, until we reached a rather large opening at the top. Beside the empty soda bottle and used condoms, the only man-made thing in the area that I could see were these long stretches of telephone poles going across a series of sandy, dry hills. If it wasn't for the 2 strips of forest on either side, I would think they would have gone on forever. This area didn't seem to have any particular importance. I had expected him to bring me to some awful cemetery in the dying light of the afternoon, but these rolling hills were pretty beautiful. I thought he might try to have some desperate attempt to scare me, but instead he just turned to me with the most serious and grim face I had ever seen on him. Here we are, Hanging Man Hill, he whispered. Hanging Man Hill? Is this another one of your stories? Kind of. Except, this one's true. I rolled my eyes at the thought. How did he possibly expect me to believe any of his stories? He just kept staring at me with that face, waiting for me to respond. How could this even be a Hanging Man Hill? There is no Hanging Man, but there's at least 6 hills out here. Look down there. Right there. Look. He pointed his finger towards the nearest telephone pole, sitting on the 2 closest hills to us. A small creek no more than 5 feet across ran between the 2 hills and carried onwards into the never-ending forest. There was no hanging man, but the pole itself seemed more ominous than the rest. Roy Terrence, he whispered. Who? It wouldn't be Hanging Man Hill without a hanging man, would it? He bolted down the hill, blazing on his orange bike. I tried to keep up, but Walmart and sporting goods don't seem to mix well. There was a faulty chain on my dull red bike. The sticks from the surrounding trees had rooted themselves into the ground and were now snagging on the dangling chain. With one mighty tug of a huge root on the bike, I was head over handlebars all the way to the bottom. I landed on my knees with a small sploosh as my legs hit the water. It couldn't have been more than a couple inches deep. I almost called for Terry to help me when I realized he had stopped just at the bottom before I had tumbled into the creek alongside him. His head was peering upwards, looking straight at the top of this dark and shadowy looking telephone pole. Little help? I squeaked. Terry broke his gaze with the pole just long enough to wrench me up from the creek and get me on my feet. After that, his stare continued to be fixed seemingly on nothing at the top of the pole, for quite a long time. Who is it, or what is it we're looking for again? I grumbled. I was going to be pretty pissed off if he had taken me all the way down here and all I had gotten out of this was a trip and a banged up knee. I hadn't noticed the pain before because the water in the stream was pretty cool, but now it stung like the dickens. Roy Terrence. He was the owner of that small shed just beyond the trees over there. I hadn't noticed the shed before. It sat behind a pretty large oak tree. It couldn't have been bigger than 4 or 5 outhouses put together. After his wife and kids left him, he hung himself on the wires right here. The cops didn't find much, just a charred up husk of what used to be a man. Legend says whoever's out here at the exact time of his death, they get strung up on the wires with him. Oh, and do tell, when would that be? For once he broke his serious tone and gave me a goofy, I don't know, shrug. Then went back to that serious and grim attitude. And you're suggesting that we stay out here and wait for him? Despite my many excuses, I have to dispute this. I think I'm going to go with the, it's late and my mom's making dinner, so I have to go home. Fine. Tell your mom that you're sleeping over my house tomorrow night, and I'll do the vice versa with my grandma. We'll meet here at about 7. And, against my better judgment, I decided that I might as well come. What harm did it do? Obviously he was lying, and if nothing else, it would set my mind at ease that he was. While none of his stories actually came true, up until this point, his sudden change of tone made it slightly more believable. When he told his other stories, he was giggling so hard that you might think he was on a pound of happy crack. When we headed home, just as the last tint of orange left the sky, I asked him, "Why did you get so serious back there? You're usually such a goofball." I lost my grandpa to Roy Terrence. My grandma was with him when it happened. Haven't you ever wondered why she was always so grumpy? His grandmother was in fact very crotchety. I never bothered to ask why she was that way. If this was all some elaborate hoax by Terry, I was going to slap him into next Thursday when this was all done. That night, I had a horrible nightmare. Like most people, I couldn't remember much about it, but it had Roy Terrence written all over it. Even though it was roasting on that South Carolina night, I woke up with the chills. By the time 6 p.m. had rolled around, I already packed up my old backpack with basic equipment, like a flashlight and 2 bags of Chex Mix, just in case we got hungry. By 6:30, I rolled into the neighborhood as fast as an overweight 11-year-old could. I had to admit, I was actually pretty excited. Finally, at around 6:55, I arrived at the small creek where Terry had already set up a small fire, and of course, he was roasting marshmallows. If I hadn't decided to show up, he would have been disappointed like hell. How exactly is this supposed to work? Are we just gonna camp here all night? We don't even know when he's supposed to show up, I said. He said with his face stuffed with marshmallows. What? He crammed the marshmallows down his throat and said, I'll wait here all night if we have to. Whatever, I retorted as I plopped down next to his fire. He had thrown in 3 lighters just to keep it lit, and I began to pull out my snacks. After about 3 hours, the first of the crickets began to sing their endless chirping as the last streak of light left the sky. I began to get irritated and a little bit tired. Terry was wide awake. His hand was glued to that bag of marshmallows. He had begun his eternal gaze at the top of that pole again. Terry, man, I'm tired. If I don't see a crispy dude here in the next hour, I'm out. Okay, he said with his cheeks stuffed out like a squirrel's with another marshmallow. I snuggled up next to the fire and began to doze off. I was just about to slip into unconsciousness. A loud, crusty, brittle peeling sound echoed throughout the hills. I immediately sat up. My vision was pretty blurred from just having dozed off, but I could definitely make out Terry's shape. He was gaping wide-eyed at the top of the pole. If there had been just a bit of moonlight, I might have been able to see what I'm sure was up there, but the crescent moon sat just beyond the trees, just like Roy's shed. In an instant, Terry was on his bike and flying up the hill, naturally, bag of marshmallows still in hand. I managed to pull myself up and get on my bike. I began pedaling like a madman, when I realized that my chain had popped off. Stupid fucking bike. With my eyes adjusting to the dark, I peered back at the top of the pole one more time before I bolted up the top of the hill. Roy Terrence was not so much a person as he was a snagging shape. His flesh, dark as the night, was clinging to his bones for dear life. His facial features were not entirely evident, but did seem to be consistent of both a state of agony and some kind of ecstatic joy. And the one eye he had left, was deep in his socket. It gazed upon me with absolute hatred and insatiable want. Just when it seemed that he was going to climb off that wire and come down here for me, the weak spine that had been holding his head to that molten pile of flesh and bone snapped, sending what was left of his skull tumbling into the fire that Terry started. It gave me one last, glowing, burning, satisfied grin before it disintegrated into a wisp of ash. I had been halfway up the hill before I realized that I was moving. I followed the bike tracks that Terry had left, which led further into the hills instead of off to the other side, where the trail led back to the neighborhood. Just as I crawled my way to the top of the hill, I saw a thin shape dangling from above. Oh no, I croaked. Terry's bike, that blazing orange bike that he loved so much, was wrecked at the base of a telephone pole. And above it, Terry's body hung limply, although it didn't look much like Terry anymore. Terry hadn't been on the wires nearly as long as Roy, which only made it worse. He was charred, but not entirely. His eyes were bulging from his face in a constant state of shock. What was left of his hair stood on end, still smoking. The seemingly endless wires above entangled Terry's neck like some kind of boa constrictor. Dangling from his scrawny, burnt little arms was a bag of marshmallows that was melted onto his hand because of the heat. The police investigation didn't turn up much. They had scoured the whole area and hadn't found any evidence that anyone was ever there. I begged for them to search the telephone wires, but they continued to state that there was no evidence that anyone had even touched the wires. The search continued for about 3 weeks. After that, the police had given up. Terry's grandmother passed away. For those last few days, she didn't say anything to anyone, at all. She only stared at a picture of her and her husband, just for the remainder of her life. After that, the house was cleared out and the contents of Terry's room were offered to me. His entire collection of horror movies and action figures, and everything else was going to be donated to Goodwill, my request. I went back a few years later. We had gone to Gaston to visit some family for a while, and I requested that we stopped by the neighborhood. Any evidence that we had ever been there those fateful few years ago had been long swept away by the weather or the police. Now, like before, there was just useless garbage and telephone poles. Just as I was getting ready to walk away, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I only saw a tiny bit of it before it fluttered away with the wind. It was a melted marshmallow bag. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of my lovely patrons: Dan R., Paul Z., Cody V., Chaos X, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, JY, Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A., Dark Side of the Bear, Daniel H., and Maximilian Charles P. Guys, thank you so much for your support. You single-handedly keep this channel alive, and I really cannot thank you enough. And if you want to help support the channel and get a bunch of little perks and whatnot, head on over to Patreon. That will be down in the description. Thank you.